Bibles to John 15. We're going to read verses 1 through 17. John 15, verses 1 through 17. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. If a man remains in me, and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not remain in me, he is like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be given to you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than he lay his life down for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I call you friends, for everything that I have learned from my Father, I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last. Then the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. This is my command: love each other. God's word for God's people. Thanks be to God. Well, I missed you all this week as I spent some time away with my family, and we spent some time in the southernmost part of the United States, in the Keys, and I had an opportunity with my temporary neighbors as we camped along the edge of the ocean to get up each morning and watch as the sun would rise and the tide would change. And so each morning I'd get up and I'd sit quietly watching for the darkness to leave and the daylight to come. And as that happened, this particular time of year, it was also tide change. So where the tide was up during the night and up at the edge of the campsite, within touching distance of where I would sit, as the sun rose, the tide would go out. So what I would see would be no more as what it became changed. Things changed in front of my life. This change was fixing to happen to Jesus and his disciples too. What they saw was soon to be no more. What they were used to was going to change. For Jesus knew the time had come that God called him to fulfill his mission here on earth among God's people. Jesus knows that his time is short, yet he feels the need to be very firm and clear with his disciples so that they will not fall away from the teachings he has shared with them. He uses the term fall away. Today, some of our churches would use a term called backsliding. And so, whatever way you choose to think of it, Jesus didn't want his disciples to backslide when he left them. So he shared with them, again in a very concrete way, what he had tried to get them to understand over the last 3 years. They must understand it, for he would soon be no longer with them in body, but be with them in spirit as he leaves them physically. Jesus was going to change, but what he would remain with them would be for always. The faith of these disciples is still new. We think of a 3-year-old Christian and we think of a new Christian. Some of us have walked with Christ for many years. Some people have gone a long way in 3 years. But we think of these ones that Jesus was handing over the mission to. These who'd only walked 3 short years with him. But he feared not only for their faith, but he feared, were they going to be strong enough to be able to take this message of forgiveness and love and peace out to all the Jews and to the Gentiles beyond that? Were they going to be strong enough to be able to stay the way? So Jesus knew that the time for parables and stories was ended. It was time to give them a concrete example, something so concrete that even a child would understand it, to give them something firm, to understand that Jesus needed his disciples to remain firm in their faith. He wanted them to remain firm in his teachings. He wanted them to remain firm in their connections to him after he was gone bodily. So today we hear the last of the I am statements that Jesus had shared with the disciples. At this time, Jesus is sharing with them, and they were a very agricultural society. They probably understood how things grew a lot better than most of us. But he takes and uses this image of vines, a very common concept. It was so common that the people of Israel even identified themselves as a nation, as a golden vine. This golden vine was even used in the temple to represent Israel. So here, Jesus chooses something that all the Israelites would really understand. They would understand how vines work, how they grow, and how they bear fruit. I kind of would imagine, as I've mentioned to you before, that when Jesus was doing this kind of teaching, I would see him being very concrete and maybe even reaching over and touching a vine or picking up a piece of a vine with fruit on it to show the disciples exactly what he was talking about. This is his last heart-to-heart talk with the disciples. Some scholars think it may have even been part of the upper room sequence the night before he gave himself up for us. So this talk, these final instructions that Jesus is giving to the disciples before he dies, is very important. This final discourse we hear has been one that has been often repeated. We know that when he talks about vines, we know that in Israel at that time, he was probably talking about grapevines. Well, I haven't spent much time with grapevines. My extent with vining has been one miserable little wisteria vine in the backyard. And this little miserable wisteria vine has a great importance to me. You see, it came from my grandmother's farm. We had to sell her farm after she passed, and all that I took with me was a remembrance of her wisteria bush. So I took this little vine and I planted it in the backyard with great hopes that the fence would soon be filled with the beautiful fruit of flowers, beautiful clusters of purple flowers. But no, that wasn't the case. That darling little stub sat there and laughed at me for almost 7 years. And finally, one day, the vine began to send out runners. And I'm patient, and I watched those runners for a couple of years. And I guess another couple of years passed. And I guess by the 10th anniversary of my grandmother's death, I saw the first flower. But I was hopeful that that vine would keep going. But there's other kind of vines that grow like that, and grow much faster than my little wimpy wisteria. If any of you have ever made a trip to North Georgia, you're familiar with a vine called kudzu. A vine that has no purpose on earth. But if you stand still long and warn your children, they might get covered up with this fast-growing vine too. For you know that every telephone pole and pine tree and rusted car and abandoned house in Georgia is covered in kudzu. It has no fruit. It simply has vine. It has no purpose, but it grows like crazy. In contrast, Jesus calls us to think about vines that produce fruit. Some of you who may try to give your hand at amateur gardening, and we do at my house in Jacksonville. We can't get grass to grow, so we try vegetables. And so we try to get things to grow. And if you've ever tried to grow vegetables, you know some of them are vines, okay? I often love when my little scraggly vines that are called yellow summer squash actually produce some fruit. It brings joy to my heart. But to cook them one at a time is not very productive. You need a bunch of them. And then the other thing, and I'm sure the children always love this one, is the ruffly vine that some of you may have tried to grow. Watermelons. What great fruit are produced by those vines. We all have different kinds of vines we've watched grow, whether it's a flowering vine or a fruit-bearing vine or a vegetable-producing vine. Think about the vines you've watched grow. Think about the vines you've seen up close and personal. What kind of vine would you imagine yourself to be? Would you be a grapevine? Produce luscious clusters of fruit? Would you be a vegetable vine and produce a sweet watermelon for your family? Or would you be kudzu and just grow and grow and grow and grow and never produce a single piece of fruit? So, Jesus wants us to think about this. Jesus wants us to take, and whatever our experience with vines is, to have a concrete example of vine growing in our head, even as he did that day as he talked to the disciples. A concrete example of how he intends for us to relate to him after he was gone. He wants us to remember what he has said and taught so that we may remain firm in our faith. Jesus wants his disciples to know that when he's gone, they need to remember that they cannot produce the fruit that God calls for if they do not stay connected to the one vine. Jesus said, I am the true vine. I am the true vine. I'm not a vine, I'm the true vine. Stay connected to me. And he wants us to understand that as we stay connected to him too, we too can produce good fruit. Jesus is not calling us to be kudzu. He's not calling us to show a lot of growth and yield no fruit. Jesus wants us to be fruit bearers. Jesus does not want us to be like some of the vines I know some of you living here in Florida have had the experience with. There's a vine I've had an experience with in my shrubbery, and it's got stickers. And it's a weed, and it'll grow and grow and grow. But the bad part of those weed vines is they choke the life out of whatever they surround. And Jesus doesn't want that to happen to us. He wants us to understand he is the true vine, and we're the branches to grow from him. He doesn't want weed vines choking the life out of us, using up the resources we need to grow and remain firm in the faith. These weed vines in our lives are things like fixations and things that we spend and get distracted by in our lives. They take our time and our energy, and we can't stay rooted to the true vine if we let these weed vines in. So one of the first things I want us to think about today is in today's reading, especially in verses 1 through 3, is God prunes faithful believers to bear more fruit. The vine metaphor goes way back into Old Testament times. It's used a lot throughout Scripture. In Jeremiah 2:21, we hear, you were a choice grapevine, but now you produce nothing but small rotten grapes. Ugh, what a picture. Producing fruit, but it's small and it's rotten. Not the fruit Jesus is calling from us. We heard also the prophet Isaiah in the 5th chapter, verses 1 through 7. It's called Song of the Vineyard. Caution us also about bearing no fruit. The prophet says, I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one has a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it, and he cut out a winepress as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I will